Feeling relaxed and chill? Yeah? Are you? Hopefully you don't have like a lot of homework when you get home now too to ruin that mood, right? To ruin that feeling relaxed. You know, I was thinking that 27 years ago, when I was first thinking about becoming a priest, and I was telling all my friends and family about it, I was very blessed. I was very fortunate because every one of them, to a person, was very supportive. They were very positive. They were very encouraging. But sadly, that's not always the case for every person that's considering a religious vocation. I'm sure our two seminarians have classmates that would say, well, they probably maybe had a little bit of resistance, even sometimes from their own family, about doing something like that. Recently, I was reading a magazine article about vocations to the priesthood and religious life. And the author was interviewing a young man who had decided he was going to enter the Dominicans. And shortly before he was going to go into the monastery, he was telling his friends what his new life as a Dominican was going to look like. And so he was telling them things like this, that, you know, he would have very few personal possessions, he wouldn't have a smartphone, he wouldn't have an iPad, and he wouldn't have personal money, that there's a structure to the day, a routine to the day he's expected to live by, that there's set times for prayer and for service and for work and for silence, and of course that he would have to be obedient to the abbot in pretty much everything that he did. So he's telling all this to his friends, and one of his friends protested. He said, wait a minute, you're telling me they're going to tell you when to eat, when to sleep, you know, when to work, when to pray, that you can't just leave the monastery whenever you want, you can't just send a text to someone if you want to, you can't go out and spend money on whatever you want anytime you want. What about your freedom? What about your freedom? And you know, the young man, the seminarian's response was perfect. Because what he said was, well, you know, actually, all these things that I'll have to do as a Dominican actually do make me free. They make me free to do what God asks me to do. They make me free to do what God asks me to do. See, in the end, that's really the only way to find freedom, is to discover what God's will is for our life, to discover what His plan is, and do it. That's how we find real freedom and real happiness. If that's not the first goal of our life, if that's not the priority of our life, then are we really free, I guess? That's the question. Are we really free? Probably not. We think we are, but we're slaves to all sorts of other things, right? Expectations from our society, from other people in our lives, sometimes unreasonable expectations we put on ourselves, right? Pressure from our culture and from other people. We can be slave to all sorts of things if our first priority is not seeking the kingdom, like Jesus says today. Seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and then everything else will fall into place, right? Now, Jesus, in today's gospel, is very aware of all the ways that we think we're free, all the ways that we think we're in charge of our lives, that we think are in control of everything that happens. In reality, of course, we're not, are we? If we stop to think about our lives, we realize a lot of it is beyond our control. And in a lot of ways, we're not actually free. So, for instance, there's a lot of people in our world that fall prey to this idea that, well, if I just somehow get more money, or if I somehow get more earning power, if I just get just the right degree, or just the right job, or if I have enough future choices for myself, then I'm really going to be free. Then I'm really going to be happy. Then I'm really going to know happiness and joy in my life. And Jesus is cautioning us. He's saying, no, that's not the case. If those things become our priority, like the only thing that we're seeking, then we're not actually going to be free. We can become enslaved by those desires, by those things. So certainly, you know, having ambition, having plans for the future, right? Earning a living once we have a job, taking care of a family, that stuff's not bad stuff. That's all good stuff. But Jesus is warning us that if all our energy and all our time first and foremost goes into all those things, without a thought for the kingdom, without a thought for what God wants for us, well, then really we're not going to be free. Those things can become our masters, and they can really draw us further and further away from God, if that's the only thing that we're thinking about in life. So when I think back to that article about the vocations, what that seminarian's friend was not understanding when he was saying, what about your freedom? What he wasn't understanding was that serving God, whether we're serving Him as a priest, as a seminarian, as a deacon, as a religious sister, as a layperson, as a as a husband, as a wife, as a child, whatever, however we're serving him. Serving God is not about being enslaved. It's not about having our freedoms restricted or taken away. Really what it's about is this, that when we commit ourselves to living a kind of a radical relationship of trust with God, what we're committing ourselves to is real freedom and real happiness. When we give God the control, when we give him our trust. We say, well, Lord, what's my role in what I have to do today? Give me the grace to do it, and things that are beyond my control, help me to give those things to you. Help me to trust you for those things, because they're beyond my control anyway. So on the surface, that sounds maybe like a bit of a paradox, trying to live by God's plans. It sounds like kind of a contradiction, but it's not. Because God is not just our master. He's not just our creator, right? As Jesus says, he's our loving Father. He's a parent who knows what we need even better than we know what we need. And he's going to provide for our needs too. So Jesus has this call in the gospel to not worry, to not be anxious, to not be nervous about things, right? Now, he's not talking about like clinical anxiety or depression or something like that, right? Where we need the help of doctors and the like to kind of cope for a while. There's nothing wrong with that. He's talking about daily anxiety and stress and tension and all those things that we just can't stop thinking about, that really kind of dictate how we act every day. He's talking about those things, about being free from that. So his call to be free from that is really just a call to have a relationship of love and trust with God. That's it. He's saying if you seek that first, if every day your number one goal is to love God more and to trust him even more, that takes care of those anxieties. It takes care of those worries. We have a lot of anxieties, don't we? Right? Like we can worry about things from the past, the things that are over and done with, and they just keep spinning around in our mind, and we beat ourselves up for things, right? Now, especially if we've already taken it to confession. That means God's forgiven it and it's done. But we tend to beat ourselves up sometimes, don't we? We can hold things over our own head for a long, long time. In a way, that's really like saying, God, I know better than you. In confession, you told me I'm forgiven, but I don't think so. I don't think I can be forgiven for that. So I'm not going to forgive myself, right? So we want to ask God for the grace to do that, if that's the case, to forgive ourselves. We can't go back and change those things anyways, can we? Sometimes we're really worried about the future. We're really anxious about the future. And Jesus says, don't worry about tomorrow. Tomorrow will take care of itself. Do what you need to do today, right? Because again, so much in the future is beyond our control anyways. And I'm sure you've all had this experience, like I have. Everybody does, that we worry and worry and worry about something in the future, and our mind goes to the worst case scenario, right? We think of the absolute worst thing that could possibly happen in those circumstances. And then the future gets here and what? It's not near as bad as we worried about, right? We think, man, I wasted so much time and energy worrying about this. It didn't turn out as bad as I thought it was going to turn out, right? Jesus says, don't worry about tomorrow. Just focus on today. Yeah, we have to plan for tomorrow as best we can, but let's focus today on having a relationship of love and trust with him. Worrying gets us nowhere, does it? It's usually wasted energy, wasted time, wasted worry and anxiety. There was a movie out, I think about a year and a half ago. It's called Bridge of Spies. Did any of you see that? Bridge of Spies with Tom Hanks. It's a real story set in the 1960s about a Russian spy who'd been living in New York City. And he was living looked like an ordinary life. I think he was like a watchmaker or a clock repair guy or something like that. Just this normal-looking kind of middle-aged guy. He finally got caught after all these years of being a spy for Russia. And Tom Hanks plays the guy who was asked to defend him in court, right, to be his lawyer. And all throughout the movie, things are not looking good for this guy. Even when it looks like he might get returned to Russia in exchange for an American spy coming back to us, right? Nothing's looking good for this guy in terms of his case and his future, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a number of times that Tom Hanks, the lawyer, shares bad news with him, and the guy kind of goes, okay. And Tom Hanks says to him, he says, well, you're not worried? And the guy's response every time was, would it help? Would it help? Of course, we know the answer, right? No. Worrying about it doesn't change the circumstances, right? So Jesus says, leave the worry alone. Set that aside. Do the things that you can do, control the things you can control, and leave everything else to God. Truth be told, we're surrounded by a society that says two things are very important in our lives: to be anxious about things and to be ambitious, right? And those two things working together can really weigh us down, really weigh us down.
So we really need to listen to this call from Jesus, for our own well-being, for our own health. The call to just have a relationship of love and trust with the Father. We know that if we worry too much, it has medical consequences for us, right? Do you know, too, that it's a medical fact that people who laugh the most live the longest? People who laugh the most live the longest. That's the exact opposite of anxiety and worry, right? Being able to laugh at what's going on in the world, right? So maybe this Lent is a good time to start on that, to be thinking, okay, every day when I wake up, is my number one priority a relationship of love and trust with God? Is that my number one priority? There's other things, of course, I have to do, but is that my number one priority? So maybe try this during Lent. Every morning when you wake up, think to yourself, okay, is there something that I think that I must do today that if I didn't do, it actually wouldn't matter? I'm not talking about going to school or doing homework, right? Okay, preparing for a test, right? Or doing what mom or dad asked you to do, right? But we have all these expectations that society puts on us, that we put on ourselves. Wake up in the morning and say, is there something that I think I must do today that if I actually don't do, won't really matter? The day will go just fine as it is. I must send this text, I must post this picture, I must, check my Facebook, I must know who's saying what, when, to who, at the exact moment it's happening, all those sorts of things, right? So there's something that I think I must do today that if I don't do, it actually won't matter. And if we take that energy we would have spent on that thing, right, and lovingly put that in God's hands, what we're going to find is that we're going to be better able to do His will, and we're going to find some real peace and some real happiness in our lives and some real freedom.